Hi, I'm Noam Maital, and welcome to the GovAI podcast. AI is the most powerful technology of our time, and government still figuring out how to navigate this new frontier. Join me as we explore how artificial intelligence is transforming public service, unlocking potential efficiencies, the risks that no one's talking about, and what happens when innovation moves faster than regulation. Today on the GovAI podcast, I'm thrilled to welcome Dustin Haisler, president of eRepublic, one of the leading voices in AI adoption in the public sector today, and his journey from serving as a chief information officer and assistant city manager for Maine or Texas, all the way to kind of president of eRepublic has really solidified him as a thought leader around this space. And when I have questions, I definitely come to him. And over the past few years, I think a lot of these questions have come to his doorsteps around tackling the complexities of adoption of AI in government, and we'll talk about some of those nuances, whether it's ethics and scalability. And some of his work has been featured in Wired, Fast Company, Wall Street Journal. And so again, thrilled to have Dustin join us here today to talk a little bit more about what's coming over the horizon in terms of adoption of AI across the state local landscape, and what are some of the challenges that we should be looking at. So Dustin, welcome to the show.
Thanks. Yeah, you got real me too. I thought about having deep fake version of me join, but figured that we're not ready for that yet. So
we should do a test episode on that, right? See if people would actually notice, and maybe train a Dustin bot, and see how well it does in the real world.
So, it just says no to everything. So,
well, let me start. I guess one thing I'm curious about, as president of eRepublic, you're in a unique position because on one hand, you work with a lot of public sector CIOs, cities, giving them insights and perspective as kind of a mediary or unbiased resource. But at the other hand of it, you're also working very closely with private sector that is working on many of these areas. And so I'm curious from that vantage point, kind of how is that perspective informed the way you think about AI adoption and some of the challenges that you see within the public sector?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I think both sides are kind of trying to figure it out at the same time. So the analogy of building the plane while we're flying it is very true. I think there's a lot of things that are kind of happening and nuances associated with both sides. I mean, I think on the GovTech kind of industry side, you have a mass rush to try to productize artificial intelligence as rapidly as possible. That is manifesting itself in a few different ways, right? There's like the embedded, generative prompts that people are trying to, put in their applications, the chatbot on steroids, being powered by generative AI. So there's kind of a lot of the party trick side of AI that I say that it's kind of hard at work right now on the application side.
I call it the lipstick solutions, right?
It is
kind of, yep.
It is. And I think, it has been encouraging to see, we're starting to see a shift now and a maturity on the industry side to start to look beyond just throwing a chatbot at something or throwing a generative prompt into it. Like, how do we actually deal with the underlying data associated with it? But there's a lot of, kind of ethics and the black box problem and all these things that we can kind of unpack. So there's a rush on the industry side to commercialize artificial intelligence. On the government side, there's a rush to try to figure out where do we actually apply this, right? I mean, as we saw, the federal government kind of came out with an executive order. The feds took a very proactive approach as it related to AI. We saw a very cookie cutter response from state and local government, where all of a sudden all the governors started, dropping executive orders saying, we know we need to do something with it, but let's inventory what we have first. Let's figure out, what those use cases are. And I think we're kind of coming out of that now. And when we look at like state and local government, it's moving now from pilot to enterprise adoption. So how do we take the sandboxes, the test, the consumer, kind of oriented use cases, and actually now look at enterprise rollout? What does that look like at scale? And I think there's a lot of questions that are still kind of remaining there. I mean, as we think about government use of AI, there's not a uniform blanket set of standards that we conform to, right? There's not a NIST kind of oriented framework that everyone points to and says, this is the gold standard, we're going to use it. And so I think, agencies and the industry are kind of working on, similar challenges. And I think they're trying to figure out ultimately, like, what do we need to have in place from an infrastructure and foundational standpoint to actually maximize the use of these technologies. There's no doubt that these technologies can revolutionize the way we do work, the way that we serve citizens, the way that we process information. It's just how to do it safely, responsibly, how to do it in a way that we don't get burned by, the simple things, right? We saw this with social media. We saw this with other things too, right? It's a general purpose technology. So now how do we actually leverage the full potential of it and do it in a safe way?
So I realized I should take a half step back here because some of our listeners maybe are not in the GovTech space or want to get into it or trying to understand it better. And, I think if you think about government services, today they think account over a third of all GDP spend in the US. So it's a massive, massive industry, horizontal market, whatever you want to call it. And so if you're thinking about AI, I mean, we jumped at some of the challenges and policies that are being put in place, but for kind of the beginner listener here, why is there even a different approach you think that's required for government adoption on AI versus if you're just thinking of, a private sector company or a tech company that's now looking to adopt a few new AI tools?
That's a good question. And there's a good distinction. I mean, government agencies, from the federal government down to the smallest of small cities are bound by different rules and regulations that require you to be able to inspect. So if I'm leveraging AI in a decision-making system and that AI denies someone benefits, I have to be able to explain why or why not that process actually went the route that it went. And people have the ability to inspect that. We have public records laws. We have all kinds of different things that allow people to have transparency into these underlying systems. And so when we think about AI, and we think about government use of AI, we can't point to it and say, well, it's a neural network. We can't exactly explain how it works. It's over our heads. We have to be able to explain how it works because people are going to ask, and we have to be able to produce records associated with that. So I think, the level of inspection, the level of, rules and regulations associated with that are also there. Governments are under more scrutiny when it comes to these types of things. I mean, if you look at just public data, even though everything is, subject to open records, there's a certain level of accountability and trust that people have in the information that their government agencies hold on them. And they actually have higher expectations on the public sector to protect that data. And although we're in an era where every day we get a different breach, letter in the mail saying we have credit monitoring paid for, I think I have it for the rest of my life. It's different when it comes to the public sector because as we start to think about how our data is used in these systems, people are going to start to challenge that as well. And we need to have all of that buttoned up in a way that is explainable, in a way that's transparent, and in a way that provides value for them. So I guess the net is there's different rules and regulations in this market that are ever changing and sometimes have to play catch up with some of the technologies. We'll see that this year as we kind of go into every state that's going back into session at this moment has some level of data, consumer protection, or AI-oriented legislation that's being, either debated or has been introduced. And so it's going to be a minefield of regulatory action that now I have to comply with, not just as an agency, but if I'm a vendor playing in this market as well, I've got to make sure my solutions are able to conform to whatever these standards are that are emerging. So it's a highly complicated landscape, but an exciting market. State and local spends hundreds of billions of dollars on information technology. And there's been a flurry of excitement, especially around these new technologies driven by artificial intelligence with how we can tackle really big, complex challenges in government. So I don't want to scare people away from the market, but just know it's a market that requires understanding the operating rules before you open that door.
Yeah, I think one thing I heard from a very, very wise person once that's been in the public sector for many years in leadership roles, and he was patient enough to explain to me in my previous startup that companies are pushing and selling product to get dollars, right? Revenue from it or cost savings. Whereas in government, the currency is public opinion. And so there's a whole different set of parameters that they look at. And I think AI falls within that prism where when you think about misuse of AI, it's a whole different level of risk tolerance or lack of risk tolerance within the government, public sector. And so I think that kind of brings about at how they think of the adoption. It takes a different curve from this experimental free-for-all that we see a bit in the private sector to a much more systemic, policy-driven approach that we're seeing. And I guess on that note, on the policy, which you started talking about, we've seen a lot of policies come about, a flurry of them. And maybe to add a bit of my own commentary, but I'm curious your take, we haven't seen them really matriculate to adoption. So typically you would expect, let's take the seatbelts, right? 1970s, NHTSA came out with the requirement around seatbelts to be put in the cars. Very quickly, OEMs complied. We started seeing seatbelts pretty much deployed across every vehicle today. Policies around AI are being put right and left by cities and states. And yet, when you look under the hood, and the point of this podcast is to look under the hood, you aren't seeing a lot happening underneath.
Yeah, no, I agree. I mean, I think you've got different flavors of policy and kind of legislative action that's happening. I mean, you have agencies that are trying to self-police by having some type of generative AI policy that's there. You have others that take the knack that their existing technology use policies cover them, and that AI is just another technology that can be regulated in the same way as anything else. Then you have states that are thinking about this in the context of consumer privacy and data, which, has some implications, not just on the agencies, but also the businesses within those markets. Then you have the federal government that's kind of thinking about it. Also from a security standpoint, we think about critical infrastructure and AI and these types of systems. So there's all these different layers that are kind of, creating a very complicated landscape. I think there's a lot of challenges. More fundamentally, one of the biggest challenges we have in the market is defining what it is we're trying to regulate. So, with artificial intelligence, there's so many different components, right, of that. It's a macro topic for a lot of different microcosms of, construct. You've got deep learning, you have the more controversial aspects of, facial recognition, you have the natural language processing, you have Gen AI that kind of sits at the intersection of those two domains. And so it's like, what are we trying to regulate here ultimately? And that's where I think there's been some confusion with some of the state actions on this, because it's like I'm regulating AI as a category, but in fact, I'm actually trying to regulate generative AI, or maybe I'm trying to regulate the more controversial aspects of like fully autonomous AI that's used in facial recognition for profiling, but I'm calling it all the same thing. And so I think that creates a lot of uncertainty. And so, kind of at the highest level, as I look at the challenges with like why people aren't just like going, oh yeah, we need to conform with this. It's hard to describe and define what it is they're trying to actually conform to and what that actual technology is. So I think it starts with definitions and really looking at that. I mean, even like if you look at how states approach a lot of the initial actions for governors was to inventory their existing systems. And so was that AI-based systems? Was that automated decision-making systems? Was that, robotic process automation? Like how deep, is every algorithm an aspect of AI? What about those that are triggered by human in the loop? So there's all these different nuances associated with it, which just add complexity to that whole regulatory conversation.
Do you think there's a path or scenario where government doesn't adopt kind of, you talked about Gen AI and AI, there's good distinction to be made about different machine learning based versus Gen AI, but we've seen government pass over, and we're talking government as a broad term, so you're always going to have innovators, but as a general sector, we've seen them pass by technologies that have come in and been introduced in the market, but really not implemented in government. So one I think about is blockchain, right? Where you see a lot of fintech solutions now implying it, but you don't see blockchain in government by and large. Is this something that public sector, state and local, can kind of just look the other way and continue humming along in their Microsoft Outlook and doing things as they are, or is it here to change? I obviously have my own take on it, but I'm very curious how you're seeing it.
I would say this is one that you don't really have, you don't have an option. It's going to happen whether you officially allow it and try to build an environment for it or not. I mean, like we've talked about shadow apps and shadow IT for decades. Shadow AI is a very real thing. Even in our own survey instruments, we find that over half of public servants are bringing some form of consumer artificial intelligence into their respective city, county, state agencies.
Wow.
And of course, it could be harmless use cases, right? I'm using it to do, copy editing to help me reply to that negative email that I got from that constituent in a nice way. But all those things have records requirements associated with it. All of them, even if you use your own personal phone, right? Like I'm doing official business on that. And my biggest fear here is that we've seen this playbook before. It was social media. If you think back to when social media first started becoming more prevalent in government, everybody was hopping on Facebook and everything else. You would have, I remember cities around Foursquare and all these different platforms that were there. And then what happened? The ambulance chasers came and they started challenging agencies to produce records associated with that. They'd started lighting up Facebook pages with profanity. Agencies would delete the records. They'd get sued for deleting the record, violating First Amendment rights, asked to produce the record. They couldn't produce the record because it wasn't a platform that they actually owned or controlled. And I think what that did is it tainted social media as a viable communication platform for a lot of cities for a period of time because they were afraid, like, if I jump into this thing, I might get sued. I don't want to deal with that. And I think AI is a little different because your staff has already jumped into it. And so now you're kind of playing catch up. And so you have to start to think about, okay, what happens when those same ambulance chasers that challenge government agencies to produce records in the social media era start to ask people to produce the prompts, the API calls, the underlying training data, all of this other stuff where you get hit with a FOIA for that. And you're like, what? Who do I give this to? Right? Do I give it to the vendor? Do I give it to OpenAI? Like, who's responsible for this? And I think that's my fear, is like, we have to get ahead of that. We have to define what it is we're regulating, have the right kind of foundation in place, but also acknowledge, like, it's going to happen. So, like, people are already using it. They're already doing it. Like, let's start to figure out how we create a safe way for them to do that at scale.
So you mentioned vendors. And I think one thing that many people are wondering and still figuring out is, what is the best way to work with public entities, and maybe what are some of the quirks and unique aspects of it? And so if you're a aspiring AI company, or you're an established company that is now building an AI feature, obviously many of them are looking to monetize this new feature and show how amazing it is. What are some of your recommendations and playbooks you would say when you're now going to engage with your, local city manager or CIO? What's your approach to them, and maybe how is that different from how they think about it in the private sector?
Oh man, we may have to turn this into like a Joe Rogan length podcast in order to deal with that. I mean,
just
I think
keep it rolling for 3 hours, right? Keep going.
Keep it rolling. That's right. I mean, I think a few things. I mean, one, even if you have the greatest, shiniest object of them all, there are 800 other shiny objects in the inbox of that city manager, that CIO, that CFO, whoever your kind of key persona is that you're targeting. So don't assume that just because you have great technology that it's going to just be something that the agency is going to drop everything, put on their purchase card and buy. There's a whole bunch of things that go into how decisions are made in government. And so it's not just, the shiniest object that wins. You also have to ensure that you're aligning to where there's already budget, right? I mean, like, agencies have budgets that are established through law. And so they can't just create more money at the state and local level. They have to conform to their existing budgetary parameters that are passed, in advance. And so that means that your solution is taking from somewhere else. So if you're trying to get something done kind of mid-year, you have to ensure that you help them find a path to procure that, or you get really flexible with how you do that. So, don't be naive about, how good your solution is. Think about the reality of kind of the budgetary environment and what you're working within, aligned to their existing challenges. I mean, cities, the great thing about the government market is that it's open, it's transparent, and you can see what their strategies are. You can see what their plans are. You can see their historical spend. Leverage that data to have, a more strategic approach to the agency. So you're not coming in saying, hey, I've created this, you should use it, but you're aligning to, I've noticed that on page 3 of your comprehensive plan, you're looking for a solution that does this type of a thing. And I've, done some background research and have figured out, we can tap into that and interface with your existing systems. I mean, like, that kind of stuff is what is music to their ears. These agencies have strapped public sector talent that is trying to balance a multitude of different projects and other things. And one of the biggest things that actually prevents IT deals, I think, from happening is not the money dynamic. I mean, I've talked to a number of agencies that have plenty of, cash to fund all kinds of IT-oriented projects. They're afraid of the implications on existing staff. and they're afraid of burnout on the staff. And so, you have to just think differently about it, because it's not an enterprise like I'm going to take my SaaS, ratios of, traditional software as a service deployments in a market and apply to this. Like, this is a different market that you have to play by different rules on. And there's a lot that you have to kind of balance. And I mean, you have to take the long road. But when you start to combine these things together, you'll find it's an incredible market that's very relationship driven. But it's also one that, as you have success, like, the beauty of it is it's not a competitive success that they're not willing to share with someone else. It's something that they're going to go and like shout from the hilltops, like, hey, I worked with XYZ solution and it accomplished this problem. So they'll become your biggest advocates and your best marketing vehicle as you start to build that ground traction.
It's one of the nicest things, I agree with you on, in the public sector. When you have a good customer and they're happy with your solution, the best thing you can do is step out of the way and let them kind of share their opinion and their perspective as kind of an unbiased view. And that speaks volume, right, to their colleagues that are looking at different things, different solutions. So I agree with that. So let me put you on the spot here before we shift gears. If you were to think about kind of getting into the details of what is, you would say, a spotlight of an opportunity specific, right, around AI and the intersect with the public sector and the state and local, that you would double down on right now, specific use case or opportunity, what would it be? And then flip side of that question, what would be the one that you'd stay away from, where you think it's a kind of a trap in disguise?
Yeah, that's a good one. I mean, I would look for, I think governance and all of those things are really hot, but I think finding ways to help agencies foundationally with data using AI to prepare for kind of the additional implications of AI, I think is really interesting to me. Like, the systems of record, all these kind of core systems, they all have like their own versions of like chatbots, let's say, that, will tap into that. But really leveraging AI at scale is about dot connecting, and it's about being agnostic to platforms. And so, like, I think the hot opportunity is like to figure out how to build agnostic AI that can start to tap into these different systems of record, bring intelligence and semantic, kind of connections to it, and allow you to leverage that for operational benefits. Like, very bullish on that. Like, anything around the system of record level of government is very sticky too, because once you start to, focus on that, it's very difficult to replace that. And we have plenty of data there. The stuff I'd probably stay away from is, the ChatGPT for fill in the blank. There are a multitude of, whether it's chatbots or pre-trained versions of, different generative models on all kinds of public data and other things. And just know that, like, these are areas that are very volatile. And as we saw with like the Uber of X business model dynamic in the past, like it's, someone's already got something there, if not the agency themselves. So I would stay away from some of the lighter weight kind of versions of that, and really focus on like, how do we solve like big complicated issues? How do we connect the dots here? I mean, even thinking about like data sharing across agency types, thinking about like confidential computing at the intersection of AI, and how we take like PII and other types of information and scrub it from these models, but still allow it to be encrypted in use. Like, those are the things that I think are really interesting, that agencies are going to desperately need help navigating as we kind of live in this fragmented world. It's also important to understand like the evolution of AI in the public sector. Like, AI is, a lot of times when I talk to agencies, they talk to me about procuring AI, and they're like, well, we get all these like safeguards in place, and we have this new form they have to fill out. And I'm like, what about Office? And like, what do you mean, what about Office? I'm like, what about like Copilot? Some of these features are updates. Some of these things are going to come to applications you already own. Like, the business model for these is still, I think, being worked out. And unfortunately, we've kind of landed in this per user per month pricing dynamic, but hopefully that will go a different direction as we go forward. But like, you have to think about like, agencies are going to have hundreds of different generative AI solutions that exist. There's no way to reconcile that. Every CRM, every ERP, every SaaS-based application is bringing this in, and they're not all leveraging the same model. They're leveraging different things. So I think this is creating a very interesting landscape of hyper-fragmented information curation by AI for us.
And do you think, on that note of fragmented, I mean, do you think we're in a market that today is fragmented because it's just the new wild, wild west? Or are we going to have, let's take a more similar domain of search where you have the behemoth of Google, right? Just dominating search and a few smaller players. Is that where we're heading with AI and some of the foundational models, or are we going to have a much more pluralistic approach to this market?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I think it depends on how quickly agentic architecture becomes, a primary way that we start to see it. I mean, we've seen like AI's kind of evolved from a standalone, like the party trick. You went to ChatGPT's website, you did things. Then it started to become more embedded into the applications that we were using, thus creating some of the fragmentation that we're seeing. You're going to see that evolve into more abstracted AI as you start to think about like your phone as a platform for a significant competition between a lot of the larger companies on like who's going to own personal AI. And then you have like the autonomous, semi-autonomous, and agentic AI that starts to intersect, which may actually be a personal AI that ends up interfacing with all these other models for you. And so I think like this is rapidly transitioning. So my view is like the agent will ultimately reconcile the fragmentation that exists. It doesn't mean that it goes away completely because I may have to, leverage different models and different applications. But if I think about architecting it for like a constituent or an employee, they're going to have an agent that does this work for them. And it abstracts the complexity of having to go and figure out certain things. I'm not going to leverage 5 different versions of, generative AI to build a PowerPoint presentation. I'm just going to work with my own preference when it comes to agentic AI. The real challenge here is like when it comes to how we separate personal versus work and like the personas associated with it. And I think the jury's still out on like whether or not consumers will have enough confidence in these underlying agentic models to actually bring both work and personal stuff together in one place. So we saw that playbook before also with like Facebook at Work, like their workplace product. Do you want to leverage a highly consumer oriented brand in order to like do work and like interact with your company? No, you want to have like your own separated domain. So I think it's going towards agentic, but there's still some nuances that have to be worked out in terms of how that kind of plays out and whether where identity intersects that.
I'm sure, when you start talking about agentic AI and people have some questions around that, I'm sure some people are getting nervous around that whole topic of, is AI going to take my job, right?
Yeah.
And I think there's a lot of different perspectives here. One interesting nuance of it is around the, what you'd call kind of algorithmic governance. So we talked today about governance as humans putting out policy, the normal ordinance, but as you get more nuance, you talk about agents acting as a multi-facilitator of different AI platforms. Does that start to become something where the AI starts to manage its own governance at the nuance level between different systems? And then, what kind of challenges does that start creating? Because there's a ton of efficiency around that. We think about security or automating of risk management, but then how does that intersect kind of with the oversight and this fear of losing control, if you will? I remember there was the Facebook AI that started talking to itself and making things up. So like, how do we avoid this kind of doomsday scenario where we start losing control?
Human in the loop. You got to keep human in the loop. I mean, I think as we think about AI for these systems, I mean, look at even the training data dynamic, right? We know when we leverage AI to create synthetic data to train itself on, that things start to go a little south and they get a little wonky. It doesn't mean that is off the table completely. I think we're finding some ways to kind of increase efficiencies there, but it just means we have to be really careful. I think right now the critical thing is like any type of AI in a decision-making system has to still have human in the loop. So like I always give the example of like agentic AI as it relates to how it will intersect government. And it will start with things like, hey, do you want to renew your vehicle registration? And I'm going to have the ability to say yes or no. And then it will go interact with the state-oriented system to do that, come back with some verifications for identity, ask me if I want to be an organ donor or whatever, right? And like do those types of things. And then I'm still the human in the loop, although it's doing that administrative work for me. Where it starts to get a little different is when it knows that every year I want to renew my registration and it takes the liberty of doing that for me and is like, hey, you're going to get a sticker in the mail in 2 to 4 weeks. Then it's kind of like, okay, wow, that's a different domain and one that like how much, like what's my comfort level there? My theory on that is it's going to be even though that sounds like crazy today.
I'd be happy for it to do it for me, by
Yeah.
the way. That'd be great.
Yeah, people are going to be more now paying like the IRS and dealing with them. Yeah, that's one thing I'm like, no, I want to always be in the loop on that. But like when it comes to those other types of things, like people are going to have the ability personally to construct what they're comfortable with, and they're going to let it do that. The same thing with like bill pay, right? Like I have parents that still don't trust, when it comes to, paying their bills, leveraging bill pay. And then you have certain bills that they'll do it on and certain ones that they won't. So I think, when we start to look at AI and agentic AI doing these types of things, people will have individual preferences that they can kind of apply as it relates to that. So I think, we do have to start to think about human in the loop. We also have to think about like AI redundancy. My other thing that I've been kind of considering, we talk about power and we talk about all these things. The supply chain is really important as it relates to this. But when you think about AI and critical infrastructure, it's inevitably going to intersect critical infrastructure, both from a, defensive standpoint with cybersecurity, if not already, as well as just optimization of these platforms. What happens when the power goes out, like at a sewer plant, right? There's a whole backup recovery redundancy system that's there. What happens when you lose cloud-based computational AI power that's optimizing a critical infrastructure system, right? Like we have to start to think about those types of systems. But back to your question, kind of on the jobs front alone, actually one thing that was really interesting, and I'll attempt to screen share here, was the World Economic Forum put out some new report kind of as it related to, the regular jobs dynamic. And this one actually had a more optimistic outlook, and it showed that AI will have a net job creation kind of capability here of about 78 million new jobs. And so, I definitely encourage, people listening to this to check out the report. The net here is you can Google information, or you can ask ChatGPT information about like AI's impact on jobs and other things, and you're going to get two extremes. You're going to get that it's going to kill everything and it's going to create a bunch of stuff. And I think the consensus to me in reading the research is that it will have an impact on jobs, but what it's going to do is similar to what we saw with other major, general purpose technologies. It will definitely impact those that, have highly automatable, functions, but it will create highly specialized functions off of that. And I think it's up to us to figure out now, how do we transition people from that into that? Like what we do at eRepublic, if someone's in a role that's very manual, I want them to be part of designing like the future role that they're in. So if they're doing a lot of work that like an agent is going to kind of interface with, I want them to be agent trainers in the future. And it doesn't mean that they're going away. It just means that I'm giving them more specialized skill set to work with.
Well, we're going to have I agree on that point. It's just a really interesting one. It's really hard to tell the future. If anyone did or knew it, we definitely be winning Nobel Peace Prize and all be billionaires. But I think I always look back at history, and you think about, Keynes as economist looking at the Industrial Revolution, and famously he hypothesized that the Industrial Revolution is going to kind of lead to us having more leisure time and being out of jobs. And his theory at the time made sense, right? If you bring in machines to automate processes, everyone's a labor worker, most of the economy, you're really going to be out of jobs sitting twiddling your thumbs. We all know that didn't happen, but the workforce changed completely. I think we're kind of at the precipice of something similar where we can what's easy for us to imagine is AI comes in and writes the paper for us, does the homework, and then we just sit there and twiddle our thumbs. But in reality, what's going to happen is we're going to fill that time, that's human nature, in terms of doing something else, right? And you talked about some of these new skills. So I'm excited to see what that will be. And on a closing note on that, so a lot of podcasts will ask at the end, what's your favorite book that you're reading now and things of that sort. I want to take it to the realm of AI since we're talking about AI here. And I know you're such a kind of AI geek in terms of different tools. You always, when we talk, you kind of teach me of new tools that I didn't know about. What would be your favorite AI application that you've been using that you think maybe some other people may not be aware of, or not as kind of commonly used as ChatGPT or the like?
Oh man, I mean, I think the thing with AI is that every AI solution and even the platforms themselves are all good at different things. So like, as you look at that, you've got like ChatGPT is of course a general purpose one. Claude is really good at like versioning multiple interconnected documents. It does really good with like its artifact kind of dynamic. Of course, coding, you have like the GitHub stuff. mean, I like kind of off the grid things like Marbleism is a really interesting tool for like rapid prototyping, leveraging, prompt to prototype. Some of the more, some of the video creation technologies like Sora and others have been fun to play with and kind of look at just how good it is, getting into the ability to prompt for, very realistic oriented imagery. So I'd look at those types of things as well. I'm trying to think of like, if I were to name one, I mean, the one that I probably use the most would be Claude. It probably to me is the most accurate. O1 is pretty good. Some of the more advanced reasoning stuff on OpenAI is pretty good too. But I'm a big Claude user.
I think it's fair to say that you're kind of more of a heavy adopter, definitely on the early side of these tools compared to many other users or government agencies out there.
Yeah.
So you're a good source for those out there that are looking at what tools, new tools out there. Go to Dustin. And
if you want to make a deep fake of like your city manager or something, you can use like Synthesia is great. You can record yourself and kind of create like a deep fake video. 11 Labs is really great with audio. So like if you grab about a minute of audio of someone, so like take Noam's minute from this podcast, and you can like take it into 11 Labs and create like Noam GPT and have it talk with his mannerisms and everything else. So you can have some fun with those. But those are just examples of like the consumer grade tools that are available to all of us. Now you understand why like people on the dark web are like, having like Zoom calls with, or they're creating Zoom calls with deep fakes of individuals to try to get, funds wired to different places. It's crazy.
Yeah. And there's so much more to come on that. That's like probably for our next follow-up podcast discussion. But I want to thank you, Dustin, for coming in for this episode. Great discussion. And I think now when we see pranksters across the city using deep fakes for their voice, we'll know it came from this podcast. So thank you again for joining, and appreciate you stopping by.
Yeah, thanks for the invite.
That's it for this episode of the GovAI podcast. AI is reshaping governance in real time, and as we've seen, the path forward is filled with both promise and complexity. But conversations like this, open, challenging, forward-thinking, are how we shape a smarter, more responsible future. The GovAI podcast is produced by Poldu, our editor is Maital, with production assistance from Shani Ra and Shakel Dro. We'll be back in 2 weeks to tackle more challenges and explore creative solutions at the intersection of AI and the public sector. Until then, stay curious, stay critical, and never forget that even the sharpest tools mean nothing without the hand that wields them.